Hi everybody. Welcome. Thanks for being here. I just want to say thanks to Manisha and Kara for your leadership and always in bringing this wonderful conference together. Now I have the pleasure of welcoming you to our panel on data-driven research findings regarding college and prison. My name is Stephen Shane. I'm the site coordinator for EPI and a senior lecturer here in the Writing, Literature, and Publishing department. My role here is going to be pretty straightforward. I'm going to be introducing the speakers, who are all going to have about 15 minutes to share some of their research with you. And then at the end, I'm sure we'll have some time for questions as well. But we'll just get started. So first, we have Curtis Tanaka, a senior program manager for Justice Initiatives at Ithaca SNR, where he has led numerous projects on increasing access to and the quality of higher education opportunities in U.S. prisons. His work is broadly framed around the question of how people access information, and through this lens, exploring the role of technology in higher education in prisons. The impact of the Department of Corrections media review policies, censorship, self-censorship, and digital surveillance on educational quality, and the impact of space constraints in program quality and scalability. He is also leading a National Endowment for the Humanities-funded project on archiving mass incarceration, exploring the ethics and practical challenges of collecting and preserving the creative works of people in prison. Beyond higher education in prison, Curtis works with academic libraries, publishers, and museums to help them better serve their users and communities. An archaeologist in a previous life, he holds a bachelor's degree in classical languages from the University of California, Berkeley, and a doctorate in the art and archaeology of the Mediterranean world from the University of Pennsylvania. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Sally Moran Davidson, who is an affiliated faculty member with Emerson College and the Emerson Prison Initiative, teaching courses in economics and finance. She is a former faculty member in the Department of Economics at Columbia University, where she specialized in macroeconomics, finance, and economic history. While at Columbia, she also taught economics to men and women incarcerated in the New York State prison system with the Bard Prison Initiative and Columbia University's Center for Justice. Sally holds a PhD in economics from Columbia University and a BA in mathematical economics from Colgate University. Sally's other interests are in the fields of cancer, mental health, and education. She currently serves as a patient advocate for the specialized program in oncology research excellence in pancreas cancer at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, as a family advisor on McLean Hospital's Patient Family Advisory Committee, and as a member of McLean Hospital's Women Mental Health Leadership Council. She also serves on the board of advisors as a member of the Development Committee at Chapel Hill Chauncey Hall School in Waltham. She's previously served on the board of trustees of the Tenement Museum in New York City. And last but not least, we actually have a different speaker with us today. We had a substitution. Robert Tynes can't be with us, but we're more than happy to welcome Daiwan Tatro, who is a legal reform advocate and strategist who has worked to bridge the gap between policy and practice. As the senior government affairs officer and an alumnus of the Bard Prison Initiative, he has leveraged his education and experience to shift public policy in favor of expanding and incentivizing college and prison. He has worked on a successful national social impact campaign in favor of Pell restoration and has enacted legal reforms at the municipal and state levels. In 2022, on behalf of the Bard Prison Initiative, he co-led a successful campaign to restore the tuition assistance program to incarcerated New Yorkers, lifting a 26-year ban. Daiwan serves as an active member of the Fortune Society's Board of Directors and the senior advisor of strategic outreach at the Democratic Congressional Committee, where he works on a number of issues at the nexus of politics, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Can we have a round of applause for our panelists, please? Thank you. All right. Kurt, come on up.
All right. Thank you all so much for being here. A tough act to follow after Dwayne, so I'm going to be counting on your generosity. As Stephen said, I am Curtis Tanaka, and I'm going to be leading off our panel, What Does the Data Tell Us? And I've been asked to do a little bit of table setting for my fellow panelists, so I'm going to be focusing more on the history of research in this space, the challenges and the current state of the field, and its implications for both policy and practice at this pivotal juncture in higher education in prisons. Before I get into that, I do just want to acknowledge some of our current work, which Stephen said in my intro. I forgot I put that all in there. But since some of these issues have come up already, I do just want to flag some of our forthcoming work, especially on technology and information access. Some of those reports should be coming out in the next month or two, so please do keep a lookout. However, what I'm going to spend most of my time focusing on today is a project we led called the Higher Education and Prison Research Infrastructure Project. I'm not going to spend too much time delving into that. Instead, I'm going to focus on just one aspect of it, which is a thematic analysis of studies that have been conducted on higher education and prisons, their strengths and limitations, and what this means, as I said, for both policy and practice. So, in terms of background for the Higher Education and Prison Research Infrastructure Project, which you will hear me refer to as the HEPRI project, the HEPRI project, the HEPRI project, any of those are likely to slip out of my mouth. But the origins of this project really came from the same question that brings us here today. What does the data tell us? And as we started looking and investigating about this question, it was interesting to find that the data tells us both a lot and also kind of not that much. The impact of higher education in prisons on recidivism is, I would say, pretty well established in the literature, and yet we're also lacking very basic information about these programs and their students. So we don't know basic information, things like how many programs are there, how many students are there, what kind of degrees are being offered, what are their success or graduation rates, transfer rates. All of these questions are generally unknown. The data we do have is mostly self-reported. Complicating this factor is that higher education in prisons is really a divided field and practice area. People are coming to this space from a variety of different disciplinary backgrounds, which has key challenges or presents key challenges for how research in this space is communicated and shared and built upon. And for that reason, evaluations of higher education in prisons have typically been limited in the past. So, more and better research is needed to fill in some of these informational gaps and to really support policymakers and practitioners with evidence to support programming that best serves the interests of their students inside. So, what is a research infrastructure, you might ask? I'm going to very quickly gloss over it. I encourage you to go to the digital space. You see the URL at the bottom here, higheredandprisonresearch.org. But essentially, we are conceiving a research infrastructure as the intersecting or interlocking systems of agreements, relationships, and incentives that coordinates, sustains, and accelerates research in any given field of inquiry. These different components can be thought of quite broadly. For example, agreements can be things like an actual memorandum of understanding with the Department of Corrections. It can also be things like methodological standards of rigor. What kind of metrics are we all going to agree to collect? How are we going to go about collecting those metrics and that data? Anyone who is involved in this space will, I'm sure, agree that relationships are critical for any kind of work in higher education and prisons. And so that is one component of these relationships, but also extends to the community of practice of researchers. How are we all collaborating, coming together, and sharing what we are learning and researching and finding? And finally, underpinning all of this are incentives. Why are researchers being encouraged to engage in the space, either because of grant funding, through tenure promotion pathways, impact, what have you? Why are people coming into the space? So that is a very, very high level and abbreviated overview of this. Again, we go into much more detail in the digital space, but I want to focus the rest of my time on one specific aspect of this project, which was a database of empirical studies on higher education in prison. Again, if you go to the digital space, you can see the database as well as some data visualizations and the underlying articles that it ties to. And again, you see the URL at the bottom here. But for this project, we conducted a search of studies, of evaluations that were done on higher education in prison. We had these 5 criteria for inclusion within the database. So studies needed to be empirical studies published after 1965. They needed to focus on programming in the United States. They needed to report specifically on the effects of academic programming, so not career and technical or vocational programming or other kinds of treatment programs. They needed to include post-secondary or higher education programming, and that is a point I will return to in just a bit. And they needed to study the relationship between prison education programming and learner outcomes, academic or otherwise. So from searching and along these 5 different criteria, we ended up with 100 different studies published between 1965 and 2020. So the database does need some updating because a lot of work has happened over the past 3 years. But those 100 studies represent 185 different scholars coming from 95 different institutions of higher education. So some very high-level trends that we noticed within this database of studies. Typically, the studies are do not appear to be their author's area of special focus. 80% of the scholars who are in the database are only listed once, and scholars who are listed, and only scholars who have multiple studies in the database, the max number of those is 3. And so what this tends to suggest is that the people who are doing this work, this is not their area of research focus. They are typically researching something else and may be doing a one-off study on this field. Studies tend to focus narrowly on an individual program or facility, so we typically do not see research studies that are operating at a higher statewide or national level, and typically these program studies include less than 100 research subjects. Perhaps unsurprisingly, studies are heavily skewed towards male subjects. Only 7% of the studies in the database represent studies focused on women, and studies generally feature positive findings. This, of course, is not a challenge that is unique to research in this space. It is a wider problem in the sciences and social sciences. People tend to report things that work rather than things that have been tried and not panned out, which leads to, of course, to a lot of reduplication. So digging deeper into these studies, it's important to point out that most evaluations that are looking at the impact of higher education in prisons are really framed around their impact on the public good rather than their impact on individual students. So the many impacts, or the impacts that Manisha began us with, things like being able to name systems, things like the mental health and benefits of participating in these programs tend not to be the focus of research here. Recidivism, as anyone who has done any kind of research in this space, tends to be the most common thing that people are evaluating these programs by. And certainly one can argue that recidivism is a student-centered metric insofar as one of the best things that can probably happen to someone is that they not go back to prison. Typically, the research on recidivism is not being framed in this way. It is typically framed as the return on investment for the public's investment of funding. So 2/3 of the studies in the database include recidivism, and 1/3 of them focus on it exclusively. And this has really led to the dialogue and the discussion around higher education in prisons around its economic benefits. And one of the most widely cited studies, the RAND 2013 study, is perhaps the one that everyone is going to be familiar with, cited multiple times, or almost every time, and is something I will return to in just a minute. Studies on higher education in prison typically use pre-existing data owned by the state. This emerges as one of the critical challenges for conducting research in this space, is access either to state-owned data or the students themselves to collect original research. So state-owned data typically underlies many of the quantitative studies. And of course, that data is being collected for one purpose. It is not typically being collected to focus on or study the impact of education, and is so being repurposed for this. And so what we can ask of this data, it tends to be limited. You will see on the slide, however, that a full 1/3 of the studies do focus on or do use original data. I will say these studies tend to be more recent, and it is the studies that are collecting original data that tend to focus more on educational or student-centered metrics as opposed to recidivism. Finally, the field of higher education in prison research is expanding and accelerating, especially over, I would say, the past 5 years. However, government investment in this research has remained fairly flat over the 55 or so years represented in the database. Only about 10 states have actually sponsored research on education. 10 states plus the Department of Justice and the Department of Education. So even though we are seeing more discussion in the field around it, it's occupying more of the dialogue in the public sphere, state investment in understanding its impact remains flat. One of the most important challenges, and something I think we'll probably hear more about in some of our other studies, is that the most rigorous, or other panelists rather, the most rigorous studies of prison education tend not to segregate higher education from other kinds of educational programming. So they're lumping in together career and technical education, adult basic education, general education. All this stuff is being studied together. And of course, if we don't segregate out these different kinds of educational programs, it becomes impossible to really see the direct impacts of different kinds of programming and different elements of programming. This is also somewhat concerning given the growing prevalence of meta-analyses or study of studies in this space, as these meta-analyses tend to bake in and perpetuate some of that homogenizing of different educational programs. And in fact, the RAND study that most people will cite, the 2013 one, was actually looking at all educational programming in prison. It wasn't specifically looking at higher education, even though it tends to be most often cited in that space. Not to take the wind out of anyone's sails, however, I do want to note that they did do a follow-up study in 2018 where they did try to desegregate different programs by type and still found a positive impact of educational programming, and that higher education or college education was the most impactful for positive outcomes. Other important trends that I want to acknowledge, most of these evaluations are being performed under the disciplinary lens of criminal justice as opposed to education. And that is one of the reasons why recidivism, as opposed to other kinds of educational metrics, so dominate the conversation in the research in the literature. Because of course, recidivism is a criminal justice metric, it is not an educational metric. Emerson College does not collect recidivism data on any of its students. That is not something that colleges and universities do. So we need to start looking at other things to evaluate these programs by. Selection bias is a key methodological challenge for conducting research in this space. So in other words, are the people who are applying to these programs just less likely to recidivate regardless? Or is it their involvement in the program that is actually having the impact? More recent studies have tried to address this, including the study out of Bard, which you see at the top of the screen, and which I believe we'll be hearing about at the end of our panel. And encouragingly, I would say, student-centered methods and outcomes are a growing trend in the research. We're seeing, especially over the past 5 years, I would say, more and more studies coming out that are really focusing on how do students find success and finding ways to evaluate that, are using participatory models that involve people who are currently incarcerated and currently enrolled in these programs to help design and to conduct the research. And so we're starting to, I think, see a more rich picture of the impact of these programs. But of course, there are many challenges for conducting high-level research in this space, given the limitations and the lack of support. So to wrap up, what does this actually mean for policy and practice? Well, given some of the limitations in the research that I have gestured towards here, I think it's important to note that major decisions are being made with very little basis in actual evidence. We certainly, as I said, know pretty well that these programs have positive impacts on recidivism, but other kinds of metrics, what kind of programs lead to the best outcomes, what kind of, the amount of programming, the level of engagement of students lead to the best outcomes, how do these programs compare? We don't really know any of these answers to any of these questions. And for me, perhaps the most clear example of why we need more research in this space is the negotiated rulemaking process that led to the restoration of Pell. For those who are not familiar with this, I will give a very brief overview. When the Department of Education undertook this process to decide how colleges would be able to access Pell for their incarcerated students, initially they proposed a series of 7 metrics by which these programs would be evaluated, and they heavily skewed towards outcomes. In the comment period, what we saw is essentially the colleges started to panic because the kinds of outcomes that Ed was asking for, there was simply no way of collecting them. They hadn't been collecting this kind of data historically, and the kind of data sharing agreements, the infrastructure to collect this data would take years, if potentially decades, to actually put in place. And so in response, Ed changed the required metrics of evaluation to only looking at input, so the things that the program was providing. And while we certainly can argue that good inputs should lead to good outcomes, we actually need to study if that is in fact the case. And I find myself in the odd situation of having written a letter to Ed telling them that they need to really be focusing on inputs, and now saying that maybe they did a little bit of overcorrecting and need to actually also make sure that we are finding ways to look at actual outcomes for students. So we need more data collection on standard metrics like completion rates, persistence, transfer. best practices and services, how are iPads and other large data systems collecting and aggregating this data, how are incarcerated students being flagged in iPads, is the National Student Clearinghouse being involved in this. We also need to do more data collection on things like earnings, goal accomplishment. Are these programs supporting the personal goals of their students? Are the students satisfied with the program? And then I think significantly, we also need to do some work to understand the funding models and the sustainability of these programs. I don't want to end on a downer, but Pell was taken away once. It can be taken away again. And the lack of research in this space, I would say, has really positioned the field to be responsive rather than having the evidence to shape narratives that will encourage continued public and political support. So I will conclude there. I do want to thank all of the many project contributors that have worked on this project, as well as the Mellon Foundation for funding it. And I will wrap up again with a last link to the digital space where the paper as well as the database can be found.
All right, and next we have Sally Moran-Davidson.
Hi, I'm happy to be here, and I'm just going to start by just piggybacking on what Curtis said. As an economist, we love data, and in order to analyze things, we need data, and there's a lack of data on various outcomes by educational attainment for formerly incarcerated people. So if there's something you get from my talk, it's that we need this data. We need this data to be collected so that we can have better support for college and prison. One thing I'm going to start with, though, before I talk about any economic effects of college and prison, is to talk a little bit about my role in teaching college and prison. And I have two stories about the positive benefits of quantitative courses taught in prison, and for me, economics courses taught in prison. So one of the courses that I teach is Principles of Economics, and I was teaching the course in the fall of 2020 to our first cohort of students. And we had just finished a chapter on demand and supply in competitive markets. We'd shifted demand curves, and we had shifted supply curves, and we had shifted both curves simultaneously to look at market adjustments. I heard a voice, and the voice said, "Sally, I need to tell you something." The voice was quiet and serious. "Sally, it's not that I don't like you, but I need to tell you something." I asked if I should sit down for this, and the student said yes, so I sat down. He said, "Sally, you've ruined my life. I can no longer enjoy anything. I read the news and curves are shifting. I watch the news on TV, curves are shifting everywhere. You've ruined my life." Well, the class laughed. I stood up, and I was so pleased. It was really the best news I'd heard in such a long time. So I thanked my student for the wonderful compliment. He was taking economic analysis and applying it to the world around him. How wonderful is that? Right? And he smiled at me and he said, "Sally, you somehow twisted my complaint into a compliment." So that's story number one. Story number two happened this past fall, and I was working with our second cohort of students at MCI Concord, and I received an email across my desk, and the email announced an undergraduate economic essay contest that was sponsored by the American Economic Association. And the American Economic Association is the umbrella organization for economists in the US. And so what they were announcing was the Andrew Brimmer Undergraduate Essay Prize. And that is an essay contest that's named after Andrew Brimmer. Andrew Brimmer was the first Black member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. And this economic essay prize was open to undergraduate students studying economics who are economics majors, and they're to write on the economic well-being of Black Americans. So I went to my students at MCI Concord, and I said, well, you know, you are undergraduate students, you are studying economics, you're not economics majors, but what do you think? Do you want to try? And they said, yes, let's try. And so they worked really hard together, and they put together an essay on the economic well-being of Black Americans. I submitted that essay to the American Economic Association on November 13th of 2022, and I promptly forgot all about it because I figured we were such a long shot to win. Well, on December 2nd of 2022, we found out that EPI cohort number 2 won the Andrew Brimmer Undergraduate Essay Prize. Yes. And they won it for their essay titled Incarcerated Black Americans, the Forgotten Unemployed. And it was really a wonderful essay that they put together. So what this really demonstrated to me is that in an environment when there is really significant challenges to access to education and self-improvement, that still hard work, determination, cooperation, and intelligence can be both recognized and rewarded. So this is a really great part about teaching these students in the prison. And I will just add that when our students in the second cohort finish their coursework, they will be earning a minor in economics, which is very exciting as well. Okay, so I'm going to start with some data, and I'm going to start with some graphs that are going to illustrate that we should be fiscally concerned about things in Massachusetts. So let's start by looking at Massachusetts Department of Correction incarcerated population. This data comes from the Massachusetts DOC, and it looks at the population under state custody. And it starts in 2013 and goes through 2022. You'll notice that in 2013, the number of people in state custody was 11,403. In 2022, it has declined to 6,236. So we have almost a 50% decline in our incarcerated population in state custody in Massachusetts. Significant decline. And this is good news, right? This is a good thing. Well, let's move on to maybe what's not so good. So what I have here is a slide on the DOC budget and the average cost per incarcerated person. So on the left-hand side, you can see the DOC budget in millions of dollars, and these are in nominal terms. So in 2018, the DOC budget was $645 million. In 2022, it was a bit over $745 million. So over that time period, we see an increase of about 16% in the DOC budget, again in nominal terms. But given the decline in the number of incarcerated people, look at what has happened to the average cost per incarcerated person in the state of Massachusetts on the right-hand side of the chart. You can see the average cost in 2018 was a bit over $70,000 per incarcerated person. And by 2022, using this data, we are just under $120,000 per incarcerated person. So we've seen, per year, yes. So we've seen a over 70% rise in that 5-year period in the average cost per incarcerated person. And to put that into perspective, since we're here at Emerson College, the cost, tuition, tuition, room and board, and fees is around $72,000 for an Emerson student. For a Harvard University student, around $77,000. So just to put these numbers into a little bit of perspective. And so the message from this is that, for me, we as taxpayers in the state of Massachusetts should be concerned about these numbers and what's happening. Okay, so what I'm going to do from here is I am going to start by looking at the mission of the Massachusetts Division of Inmate Training and Education, and I'm going to survey the landscape of college and prison in the state of Massachusetts. I'm going to say something about the economic benefits of college and prison, and again, I have to reiterate what Curtis said about the lack of data by educational attainment for formerly incarcerated people. Hopefully, I then can still say something about the costs versus the benefits of college education in the state of Massachusetts, and I will be drawing on the RAND Corporation 2013 analysis for that. Okay, so that's where we're going. And so let's look at this mission of the Division of Inmate Training and Education, and I'm just going to focus on the very last sentence, and I hope that we can keep that in mind throughout this presentation. The ultimate goal is to support successful inmate reentry, which has been shown to significantly contribute toward a decrease in recidivism and thus an increase in public safety. So our goals are lower recidivism and higher public safety. Okay, so we'll keep this in mind, and we're going to move on to think about the landscape of education in the Massachusetts state prison system. In the Massachusetts state prison system, there are 2 educational programs and 9 vocational and technology programs within the state system. I'm going to focus strictly on the educational programs. The educational programs are the Adult Basic Education Continuum, and I'm throwing this up here so we can see it because it's really important to have a robust high school education program, because that will prepare college-ready students who can then benefit from college and prison. So the ABE continuum to me is really crucial, that we provide really strong high school education in prison. What you'll notice for fiscal year 2020, that just under 1,200 incarcerated people were served in the program. The salary cost of the ABE continuum was just over $3 million, which might sound like a lot of money, but when you look at it as a share of the DOC budget, it's really quite small. Okay? But again, preparing students to take the high set so they can be college ready and college eligible is key. I want to move on to looking at now college programming. And so there are 5 institutions that operate in partnership with the Massachusetts Department of Correction to provide college programming. And those are Boston College, Boston University, Emerson, Mount Wachusett Community College, and Tufts University. Within these 5 institutions, 3 are BA degree granting programs. That is Boston College, Boston University, and Emerson College. Tufts University, working with Bunker Hill Community College, provides associate's degree, although soon we expect that they will be providing Bachelor of Arts degrees, which would be wonderful. And Mount Wachusett Community College provides certificates. Approximately 213 incarcerated people currently are enrolled in college courses in the Massachusetts state prison system, and this is still a small number, only about 3% of those in DOC custody. Of those 213 people, 77 are working toward their Bachelor's of Arts degree. Okay, so what we're going to be hearing from Dewan and the research at Bard is about the really significant reduction in recidivism rates due to college education degree, Bachelor of Arts programs for college. So he's going to talk about that, and we know that that directly supports the Division of Inmate Training and Education mission. What I want to talk about is labor market outcomes. Can we say something about the effects of college and prison on employment, on unemployment, and on earnings? Or at least can we say that the benefits of college and prison exceed the costs? Unfortunately, I have a lack of data to be able to say much of anything. And so again, we really need the data to support our research. But I'm going to draw on what's there, and hopefully I can say something that will support college and prison in Massachusetts. And why is this topic important? Why do we care about labor market outcomes? Because the labor market today increasingly requires a college education to be able to access those skilled jobs that are in demand, and in face of a social safety net that continues to erode. So college education is no longer, I don't think we should think of it as a luxury, but rather as a necessity. The Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce predicts that by 2027, 70% of jobs will require college education. So that means only 30% of jobs will be open to those with a high school degree or less, okay? Necessity of college, not a luxury of college. Okay, so what are the labor market benefits of a college degree? And here economists are quite clear when we look at the population at large in the US. So what I've graphed here are unemployment rates by educational attainment. These are data from 2021. And what we can see is that on average in the US in 2021, the green bar, the US unemployment rate was 5.4%. Notice that for those with a bachelor's degree, the unemployment rate is significantly less, 3.5%, while for those with a high school diploma or less than a high school diploma, unemployment rates are significantly higher. Again, we don't have data on unemployment rates by educational attainment for formerly incarcerated people. However, the Prison Policy Initiative did estimate unemployment rates for formerly incarcerated people. The unemployment rate for formerly incarcerated people is 27%. To put that into perspective, this is higher than the unemployment rate in the US during the Great Depression. Okay, so we're talking about a really dramatically high unemployment rate. What about employment rates for formerly incarcerated people? Once again, we just don't have the data on employment rates by educational attainment. However, a December 2021 report by the US Department of Justice looked at employment outcomes for those released from federal prison in 2010, and that report paints a very bleak picture. Of those released from federal prison, a full third of those released found no employment in the 4 years after their release. Third of people did not find a job at all in 4 years. And of those who did find employment, they were predominantly in low-wage sectors, in waste management, in administrative support, in retail, in food service. So employment outcomes are not that great. We know that higher education levels correspond to higher pay. So again, I'm pulling data for the US as a whole because I'm lacking data on formerly incarcerated people. And you can see, this is what I've graphed is average weekly income by educational attainment for 2021. For the US as a whole, on average, income was just over $1,000 per week in the US. If you look at those with a bachelor's degree, you can see it's significantly higher, about $1,300 per week. And for those with a high school diploma or less than a high school diploma, it's significantly less, down to $626 per week for those with less than a high school diploma. Again, I don't have data, as I said, for formerly incarcerated people. However, a report by researchers at the Brookings Institution found that found that of the formerly incarcerated people who had jobs, 80% of them earned the federal minimum wage or less. So we're talking $7.25 an hour, right? The federal minimum wage, $7.25 an hour, hasn't been changed since 2009. And if you work full-time at the federal minimum wage, you are going to earn less than $300 a week. This is certainly not a living wage. Now, of course, in Massachusetts, we're in a better position. In Massachusetts, the minimum wage is $15 an hour. So if you work full-time at the Massachusetts minimum wage, you are going to earn $600 a week, less than that of someone with a high school diploma, and again, definitely not a living wage. Now, this is just a snapshot of the earning power of a college degree, of a bachelor's degree. But what we need to think about is that once you have a degree, we have to think about your earning power over your entire lifetime relative to if you did not have the degree. So when we sum at increased earnings over a lifetime, we get what's called the college wage premium. And it's estimated at about $1 million for someone with a bachelor's degree. They earn $1 million on average more over their lifetime relative to someone without a college degree. However, the economic research that looks at that assumes traditional college students, right? You enter college right after high school, you complete college in 4 years, and then you immediately enter the workforce. Now, this certainly doesn't describe the students who graduate with college degrees from prison. Most formerly incarcerated college students are going to be older than traditional undergraduates. And they are going, so because they're older, they start later, their lifetime earnings are of course going to be less. In addition, they face significant barriers to employment even with a college degree. Many employers are reluctant to hire formerly incarcerated people, and there are other barriers to employment for returning citizens. So we already have to battle that. However, even saying that, a RAND Corporation analysis between employment and participation in correctional education finds that the odds of obtaining employment if you have correctional education in the prison system, is 13% higher than the odds of finding employment if you have not had correctional education. So even though we don't have the data, at least we see that correctional education in some form increases the probability of employment. They did look at post-secondary education, but again, small sample sizes, so they weren't really able to say anything. Okay. So what I'm going to now look at is I'm going to move beyond thinking about an individual. For an individual who is incarcerated, the benefits of college education in terms of labor market outcomes are probably positive. There are no personal costs incurred by incarcerated people, and they have higher likelihood of employment. So we can say yes for an individual. In terms of labor market outcomes, the results are likely positive. But I want to think about the state of Massachusetts. And I want to think about this because of the slide we saw at the beginning, that the per person cost of incarceration is now on the order of $120,000 per year. So I want to think about that. So we're going to use an analysis by the RAND Corporation, use their methodology to think about the benefits and costs of college education. And these are the assumptions that I've made that we need to be able to do this kind of back of envelope analysis. So to think about the cost of providing education, I'm assuming the average annual cost of providing college education in prison is $10,000 per student per year. Where did I get this number? This number comes from an analysis from Bard College of the approximate cost of providing a Bard college education in prison. Unfortunately, we don't have data on any direct cost to the state of Massachusetts of college programming, although I do want to give a quick shout out to those in the DOC that definitely support college programming and support me as an instructor, the director of education certainly, and a shout out to the principal at our school, Dennis O'Neill, who does an awful lot to support college programming, and we don't pay his salary. Okay, so that I just want to be very grateful for those things. Okay, so I'm assuming $10,000 as the annual cost per student of providing college education in prison. And then I'm just thinking about the annual cost of non-college education, thinking about the cost of the ABE continuum. So I took the salary cost of about a little over $3 million, divided by the number of people served, increased it over the past 2 years by the rate of inflation, and that's where that $3,080 number came from. So these are our costs. And where do the benefits come from in providing education and college education? And they come from the fact that the state can save money if it doesn't reincarcerate people. So what we want to think about is, what is the rate of reincarceration for participation in correctional education or non-participation or participation in college education? What's the average annual cost of incarcerating someone? And then we can get our benefit if we can save on those costs. So I'm using Pew Charitable Trust estimates of 3-year reincarceration rates for non-participants in correctional education. So if you didn't participate in correctional education, your 3-year reincarceration rate is 43.3%. If you did participate in some correctional education in prison, the reincarceration rate falls to 30.4%. And now, in terms of participants in college education, I'm assuming 4% based on Bard College's estimates of recidivism rates. However, I also do the analysis for a 10% reincarceration rate for participants in college education, and I think of that as my upper bound. Okay, now the costs of reincarceration. Suppose somebody comes back into the prison system, is reincarcerated, and the average annual cost per person of incarceration is $120,000 a year, which is what we saw on our slide at the beginning. And the average length of stay in Massachusetts is 3.57 years. So the average reincarceration cost is on the order of $428,000 for someone who returns to prison. Okay, so now let's take those numbers, and I'm going to assume a hypothetical pool of 100 incarcerated people. And I have 3 scenarios. Scenario number 1 says, we are providing no one in that pool any educational programming. Scenario number 2 says, all of the people in that hypothetical pool of 100 people receive some educational programming. And scenario number 3 says, all people in that 100-person hypothetical pool receive college and prison. So let's think about what happens. Start with scenario 1. No one receives educational programming. The reincarceration rate is 43.3%. So of those 100 people, 43.3, I know we can't divide people, but economists do this all the time. 43.3 people return to prison, are reincarcerated on average for 3.57 years at $428,000, and the cost to the state is $18.5 million of reincarceration costs. Okay, now let's move on to scenario 2 and say, take those 100 people and all of them receive educational programming. The reincarceration rate drops to 30.4%, so 30.4 of them will return to prison for 3.57 years on average, and the cost to the state is on the order of $13 million. So we can already see a benefit to the state of educational programming in a decline in the cost of reincarceration of about $5 million. Okay, so that's good. Now let's go on to scenario 3. Let's have all of our hypothetical 100 incarcerated people receive college and prison education. If they do that, and I use my 4% reincarceration rate, 4 of those people will return to prison. They'll be incarcerated on average for 3.57 years. The cost to the state will be on the order of $1.7 million. Comparing our first scenario with our third scenario, we have a saving to the state of around $17 million. This is a clear benefit to the state. If you don't like my 4% reincarceration rate, you think that's too low, let's go with 10%. 10% reincarceration rate for those receiving college and prison gets us to 10 reincarcerated people. The saving to the state is on the order of $14 million. So we're thinking about a significant benefit to taxpayers of the state of Massachusetts. Yes? Yep. Yep. In terms of this, I did not see any data on, and Curtis, you can chip in on that.
Nothing leaps immediately to mind. I will think.
Yeah.
But I don't think
I haven't seen
I don't
it
think we
myself, but yeah.
as well.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and also, at least in Massachusetts, and Manisha, you can tell me if that's true. We are not teaching in Framingham, and is there any college programming in Framingham? Okay. So let me just quickly wrap up and say, if we compare the savings to the state, I shouldn't do that, savings to the state of providing college and prison education, compared with the cost of providing college education to 100 people of $1 million, the benefits clearly outweigh the costs to the state of providing this education. So I'll quickly wrap it up. In conclusion, rising Department of Correction budgets combined with falling prison population have resulted in very high average incarceration costs in the state of Massachusetts. And we saw that in our beginning. There are benefits to college education. We know that. Economists have researched it on employment, unemployment, on earnings, but we're lacking data on labor market outcomes for formerly incarcerated people by education attainment, and we really need that data. My last bit of analysis shows that providing college and prison is cost effective for Massachusetts. The benefits clearly exceed the costs. And so that is something we should do. And that is even abstracting from the benefit of the fact that if people leave prison and they get jobs, they are now taxpayers and they are contributing to government coffers in addition. And I didn't even touch that. So I'll just wrap it up and thank you for listening.
We see your hands. We're not trying to not ask questions right now. We just want to make sure that we save at least 15 minutes per Daiwan. So maybe take a note, and we can definitely circle back to Sally and the rest of our panelists with any questions you have at all. One moment as I'm pulling up Daiwan's presentation. Daiwan, whenever you're ready.
We're now in the afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to say that these are not my slides. I'm presenting for a good colleague of mine, Robert Tynes, who is dealing with the dynamics of operating a college prison program back in New York that required his attention today. So I am a stand-in, and hopefully I can do his research in this presentation some justice. But before I do dive in, and while I do understand the need for data-driven solutions and facts in this space, I just want to say that we did not research our way into mass incarceration, right? We Willie Hortoned our way into mass incarceration, right? The meta-analyses of prisons in the United States say what? That they exacerbate crime and criminality, that they are criminogenic, right? So prisons are not making us safer, right? That's what the data says. And so our policy writ large tends to be out of sync with data in ways that don't always make sense. You know, an example of that is that we know pretty definitively that people age out of crime, right? And yet we have 60, 70, 80-year-olds in prison all over the United States when they are the least likeliest people to recidivate, right? That is about punishment. That is not data-driven. That is not about rehabilitation. And if we want to dive into the economics of that, we know that it is a huge public cost to incarcerate ailing older people in terms of the healthcare costs, right? So when we think about mass incarceration, right, we have to first and foremost recognize that it is not a data-driven field. It is not a data-driven solution. And actually, the data says it doesn't work, right? But the data that is being presented today, I believe we can use it in tactical ways to communicate about the values of certain type of work and the ineffectiveness of the system writ large to produce public safety, successful outcomes, to help change and transforms people's lives, right? So just to say, when anyone talks about the data, just realize that, vast majority of Americans have a completely theoretical relationship to prisons, to policing, to crimes, to criminality. I was recently home, watching nightly news. Unfortunately, my mom likes to watch it back in Albany, New York, and there wasn't enough local crime that evening. So we were watching stories that the news had imported from St. Louis and Philadelphia, right, to meet the requisite fear factor, right? And so my mom is concerned about crime in general because it's what she sees on the news every night. There's no relationship actually to her community, right? And the vast majority of Americans have a theoretical relationship to crime, right? And so part of using this data is mobilizing it in parallel with life outcomes and people's stories so that we can change hearts and minds and try to get to a point where we're implementing effective and cost-effective and smart public policy. That is not where we are, and the data alone is not going to change that. Go back a little bit. And so the name of this paper is Effects of College and Prison and Policy Implications. It was written by Matthew J.T. Denny at the Yale Policy Lab in collaboration with Robert Hines at the Bard Prison Initiative. I'm skipping some of this. So this is where I want to start, and in relation to BPI. For 20 years, we've insisted that recidivism is not an educational outcome, that it is a dismally low and cynical way to imagine or measure student success. Recidivism is not the lens through which we understand the value of education, right? We know that people writ large who are educated, college educated in particular, commit crimes at lower rates, are more successful, so forth and whatnot. Why should we expect that to be any different or recognize it in a different way when we are talking about incarcerated people? Why should we be measuring these systems by different metrics? And if recidivism is a measure of anything, right, is the failure of the prison system, of the criminal justice system to rehabilitate anyone, right? And that's what's reflected here, right? Recidivism rates are more the reflection of a failed social policy and dysfunctional parole system. I spent 12 years in prison. After 12 years, the state gave me $40 and a bus ticket and said, good luck, right? That is not in line when trying to keep someone out of the system, right? We don't have a system that is facilitating success. We have a system that is perpetuating failure, and I know that too well. But I was able to get an education in prison, and that radically changed the trajectory of my life. Nevertheless, there are people in this world who love data, policy makers, foundations, so on and so forth. And I remember sitting down with a large foundation in New York, and they sat across the table from us and they said, well, we have one problem here. If a student begins with BPI in prison, but they get out and complete their education at CUNY, what organization gets the the credit. They said, because if they're getting a degree from CUNY ultimately, and you're our grantee, and CUNY's not our grantee, how do we fit that into our data sheet? And we looked at them, we said, the student gets the credit. What are we measuring here? And long story short, they didn't give us any money, right? So just to say that this data thing and this type of mentality really holds sway in some spaces, unfortunately. So quick overview of BPI. Bard Prison Initiative, college and prison program started a little over 20 years ago in New York State. Today, we have about 350 students across 6 New York State correctional facilities. We offer both AA and BA degrees. Over the lifetime of the program, we've served about 1,200 students. We've conferred 600 AA degrees and over 150 bachelor's degrees. Curriculum. AA takes 60 credits, a BA is 120 credits, and then we have public health and education specializations. Writ large, our program requirements in an academic sense mirror those of Bard College in general. Our students have to take the same suite of first year classes as well as complete a senior project in order to graduate with a BA. Many of our classes are taught by the same professors that teach on our main Annandale campuses. We try to mimic the application process for people incoming and mirror that of what would be available to anyone on the main campus. So students take a essay-based interview, writing test, they sit through an interview, and then like any college students, they would sit, unfortunately in a cell in this case, and wait for an acceptance letter. Now we get to the findings of the study. And to be specific, we looked at our students over the lifetime of our program because we wanted to be able to put together a really clean and neat metric that doesn't have some of the confounding factors of some of the data that we just saw. And so this slide is very interesting because we see the let me get to the next one, because we see the recidivism rate of the general docs population, right? But then something very interesting happens, right? It actually falls for people who apply to the program. It falls for a little more for people who interview in the program, and then it drops dramatically for BPI participants. So what does that tell us? That tells us that there's a whole population of individuals who are not making it into college and prison programs, who are probably ready to be in those programs, who are expiring and are hungry to change the trajectories of their lives and don't have the opportunity, right? But they may, and so are probably finding other ways within the system to help better themselves. And that could be through correctional education programs, so forth and whatnot. But just the fact that someone applies to a college and prison program or interviews with a college and program produces a reduction in recidivism or demonstrates a reduction of recidivism should really tell us that we should be thinking differently about the capacities, the motivations of incarcerated students and giving them more opportunities to do more productive things with their times every day in general. So quick recidivism by the numbers. In New York State, for the general population, it is 41.5%. For our students, again, over the lifetime of our program, after earning an AA degree, it drops to 8.3%. After getting a BA degree, it drops to 3.1%. And not only can we break this down by degree, we can also graph this and see that there is, I was a math major, by the way, there's a direct and negative correlation between the number of courses completed by a student and recidivism rates. So unbelievably, the more, or I should say what shouldn't be unbelievable, is that the more educated a person is, literally, the more classes they take and complete, the least likelier they are to return to prison, irrespective of their degree completion. That is fascinating. And that is important because that tells us not only are degrees important, but that education, higher education in prison in general, irrespective of a degree, is important. So the policy implications for this, and I hope everyone in this room knows this, but college in prison is nothing but a net positive, right? I don't see any downsides to this work. The data that we do have agrees with me. Students who enroll in college and prison programs have far lower recidivism rates, general population, and those rates decrease even further with more credits and degrees earned. And this points to, a specific policy piece where, one of the problems that we have across prisons is that we may have a student in a college in prison program, and then all of a sudden the DOC decides we're going to move them to XYZ facility and disrupts their learning, right? And so if we know that college and prison programs have these benefits, we should be doing everything we can from the policy perspective to ensure the continuity of students' educations, right? So I think I'm gonna land this here. I love this picture, and actually Spencer's a good friend of mine, and he's out and he owns 2 small businesses. But as I started this off with saying that, we did not research our way into mass incarceration, I do want to hammer down on the point that data, how we use the data in a tactical way to impact policy decisions is important, but I do a lot of government affairs on behalf of BPI, and I've worked on Pell restoration and co-led the campaign to restore TAP last year in New York, have passed some legislation to incentivize college and prison. I am currently working on another bill to further those incentives. And every time I sit down with a policy maker, yes, they want to hear the data and the facts, but it never gets me what I want, right? Showing up in the room with people like Spencer who can share their stories and ground the realities of the data, right, is really what always has moved the ball for me, right? And at first, that seemed out of sync with what I should have been doing, right? You go into this thinking the data is the thing that is going to move policymakers, and then you sit back and reflect that actually the data is not the thing that got us to where we are. It is people lobbying on behalf of special interests that has produced mass incarceration because it creates jobs in XYZ communities, so on and so forth. And so I have to show up with the people who are being impacted by these harmful systems and pose a solution. If we give them a way out, right, these individuals become walking, talking examples of some of our best ideals, right, and principles. Our belief in redemption, rehabilitation, second chances, right? And so I, someone who relies on Robert's data that I just used very, very heavily, but never, and have a commitment to never doing that without also foregrounding the individuals whose lives and hard work and experience has created those data points. And if we could keep these 2 things in line and understand that the narratives are just as important as the data, I think that we can make real progress to change public policy in effective and smart ways. I'll just end by saying this, that in 1994, when the United States government, Congress, banned Pell, put the Pell ban in place to incarcerated individuals, they knew then just like they know today after we've restored it, that if someone got a college education in prison, they were not only the least likeliest to go back, but had the most successful life outcomes. It was indisputable. They still put the ban in place. New York followed suit. Illinois did it 5 years before then, due to the ugliness and bigotry of our politics. But because of the narrative change work that we've done over the past 20 years, we restored Pell under Donald Trump, of all people, with bipartisan support, right? Last year in New York, when I co-led the campaign to restore TAP, and I did the polling, we found that restoring state-level aid to incarcerated people had plurality support amongst 2020 GOP and Trump voters. It was a nightmare issue for any Republican politician because it split their base in half. We did not expect to find that, but we did, and they were nearly silent on the issue. And that's not because they understood the data or the facts, right? That's because we have done a ton of narrative change work on top of the research, on top of the studies. College Behind Bars, if anyone has seen it, is not a data-driven film, right? You get some data in the subtitles, but that's not what it is. It is about people, and people relate to people. So I'll just end by saying that we can't lose sight of individuals, of students, of people for the data points, but that the data is important, but that we have to mobilize it in tactical and smart ways to produce good public policy. Thank you.
Okay, well, we just leave this up here. This is like a great background for the rest of our talk. We got a few minutes. We're gonna run just a little bit into lunch, which is fine. We start a few minutes late, and it's lunch. We'll be fine, you know? But also kind of, Daiwan, building off your point, like, we're screening College Behind Bars later today, or at least an abbreviated version of the film, and Daiwan will be here to talk about it with us as well. And stick around because we have alumni from EPI here as well who are more than generous enough to share their personal stories with us. So those stories, Daiwan, that you're talking about, we need to foreground. That's happening later today. So please stay here with us for that. In terms of questions, let's just start. And what I'll do is if people want to come up to the mic, that would be great. I saw some hands already earlier, so we can just get started.
I just wanted to finish my comment. Did you find anything regarding certificates? And the reason why I say that is because college has been making shift into certification for individuals who are going into trades. I work for a company called Transfer VR, who actually helps with individuals getting them set up to go into a trade or going to any type of career, but at least finding out what that may be for themselves. And we've seen a shift in regards to saying, hey, you know what? If you're not going to stay the full years, take the certification and then go to this apprenticeship program or go to this employer or go to whatever. And we've seen a shift in that. And I was curious to find out, did you run across any numbers or trends in regards to that as far as workforce development?
So we were focusing mostly on college level programming rather than certification. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done both in just main campuses as they start to build these kind of certification programs, as well as in the prison space. So is this not? Oh, I just need to be closer. I think one of the main challenges that we have seen discussed in departments of corrections is the need to keep those skills and certifications programs current with employer wants and demands, and DOCs, I think, typically have been updating those programs more slowly than they need to make sure that their students are leaving with certifications and credentials that are actually industry appropriate and accepted by the industry. So I think this is an ongoing problem in that space, for sure.
And then I think it's just also important to recognize in that the same way in that incarcerated people have been denied access to public funding for the purpose of higher education, they've also been banned from numerous different types of licensing structures as well as certifications. Once upon a time, you get a barber's license in New York State Prison. Then the barbers got together and said, we don't want these formerly incarcerated people being able to compete against us in this great capitalist society, and so we should ban them from being able to be barbers, right? And there are actually over 30,000 laws on the books, United States, banning incarcerated people from different types of job licensing programs, certificate programs, and opportunities. And by the way, there's absolutely no data behind any of these bans.
And
None.
I'll just add one more thing, and that is what I've seen personally about the benefit of providing technology. We don't have certification, but the use of technology in the context of the classroom. We're really fortunate at Emerson Prison Initiative in Concord that we have brand new laptops that we got. When did we get them? Yeah, last summer. And so what's really cool about that is that in the context of economics, I want my students using the technology, being super comfortable with Excel and data, feeling confident to do things that might be demanded of them in the workforce. And so I've worked with the students. It's not a certification, but every week we work on Excel and we do data work, and now they do all their homework on Excel, and they're increasingly comfortable. So this is not a technical certification, but it's within a college program trying to take the recent technology to be responsive to employers and what their needs potentially are. So that's one thing we're doing as well.
That's a great picture, by the way. Two in the weeds questions, well, three actually, on the thing with 3.57 years for reincarceration. Does that include new crimes and parole violations? And what is the percentage of new crimes and parole violations on recidivism? All right, you get that one? And now you said there was 12,000 people when you started the survey and dropped down to 6,000 on the total amount of people that were incarcerated in Massachusetts.
I'm sorry, what is your question about that?
My
12,000?
question about that is how many guards were working at the 12,000 and how many are working at the 6,000? Was there any drop in guards when there's a 50% drop in prisoners? Oh, it went up. Oh, gee, more guards and less prisoners? Oh, gee.
But
And the reason why I know that is
okay.
because I just left there.
Oh, thank you. And I do just want to drill down into the recidivism question there. And as I said, and as I think we've all said, it is a problematic metric, but people too often make the mistake of thinking of recidivism, of conflating recidivism with crime or new crimes. For example, what we found in New York, and we passed a law to change this, is that in some years, 2/3 of the people committed to New York State prisons were on technical violations of parole, not new crimes. These are 30, 40-year-old men and women who are being sent back to prison literally for coming home after 9 o'clock at night, for having a beer after work, X, Y, Z, right? And so we should not conflate recidivism with crime. As I try to emphasize in my presentation, that it is more a measure of sort of these structural barriers to success, right? We're putting in people in prison because they had to go to work instead of report to their parole officer, and then they got violated for not reporting.
Good afternoon. I loved all your presentations. They were right on. My name is David Williams. I'm formerly incarcerated. I came out last October. I did 40 straight years. So I was at Norfolk Prison. In 1982, I went to Walpole State Prison, the worst prison in the country. I survived it. In 1988, I met a man at Walpole State Prison that was in the mafia. He actually tutored me. He tutored me in the gym. He tutored me in a classroom. Back then, there was no program at Walpole State Prison. He told me to go to Norfolk State Prison, which I did. My friend said, "You're crazy. There's nothing in Norfolk State Prison but education. It's not for you. You can't learn. You're doing a life sentence, David." I didn't care what my friend said. I went down to Norfolk Prison because I was tired of the violence at Walpole. I met some men there in the program. Back then, they had BU and UMass. I applied. They accepted me. In 1996, I got my degree, my liberal arts degree from Norfolk State Prison. It was the proudest moment of my life. So here I was for the first time in 1986, and only 2 of us got our degrees because Governor Weld stopped the program. So instead of getting my master's, I get my liberal arts degree because he ended the program. So I had enough credits to do that. Here I was in the auditorium with 250 men holding that up, and they all broke down. I mean, these were tough men back then because I made that change. And the point I want to make is the cognitive change one has because of education, because of books, because of knowing, wait a minute, I can be somebody. I can actually move forward in my life. I'm not that convict. I'm not that criminal no more. Someone's giving me a chance to change my life. And once you do that, your recidivism rate goes down completely. No longer do I ever think about criminal activity. And believe me, when I was a young man, that's all I ever did was criminal activity. I don't think about that now. So I turned my whole life around in prison. I facilitated men in the CRA, Criminal Recovery Academy. I facilitated men in the college programs there. I was there when they took the degree programs away. We tried to help at Norfolk to get with the legislatures to change all that. The DOC didn't want to hear it. Even back then, the guards were getting free courses at VU. But there were people in our government that didn't want any of us, and I was one of them at the time, to educate ourselves because it said it's meaningless. Well, now they're letting men out of prison that have been in 20, 30, 40, 50 years. I know a man that came out last week. He did 52 years. But he came out, but he's got an education. So that's the point I want to make. It's about all the matrix and the money and all that, but it's about the change. The cognitive thinking, the criminal thinking goes away completely. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for sharing, and you made a very, very important point, and I just want to lift it up for everyone in that, for us at the Barred Prison Initiative, we do not screen students on the basis of their conviction or how much time they have, because you never know when someone is going to get out, and because we shouldn't write off any human being. And contrary to popular belief and what we may see in the media, and despite all the rhetoric about being tough on crimes, according to Prison Policy Institute, 95% of people incarcerated in this country are getting out someday. And we have better be thinking very carefully about the state at which those individuals are returning back to their communities. We need more Davids, even after 40 years.
I would first of all like to appreciate all the panelists. You all did a good job. Thank you. So my question is the net benefits of correctional education. Looking at the Rand Corporation methodology, I could understand the non-participation in correctional education, which is, you said 43.30%, while the participation in correctional education is 30.40%. And the participants in college education is 4%. Can you please explain the basis of that 43.30%? How did you come about that? Because I can't.
That first one, it comes from research conducted by the Pew Charitable Trust. So those are their numbers based on their research of reincarceration rates if you had no college program, no correctional education programming versus correctional education programming.
Okay, thank you for that, because I did the calculation, it was not. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. Sorry, but panelists are still here afterwards. We can still talk.
I don't have a question, but I just want to say I appreciate for all the prison initiative institution coming here together, trying to providing higher education for people in prison. But my country, like when I compare all these like a program to my country, like in my country, nothing like this is like available. But also there are rules and laws in the United States that protect prisoners that doesn't get beaten up by a correctional officer. In my country, police can beat you up and nobody can do anything about it. Correctional officer can beat you up, nobody can do anything about it. And another thing that I really appreciate the United States for providing opportunity for everybody. Even if you make mistake, you still have opportunity to be who you want to be in the future, rather than being like living in the bad situation forever. Also, it's kind of pros and cons. I mean, not correctional officer, law enforcement officer in the United States shouldn't have that much of a power. I mean, if a correctional officer, if a law enforcement officer put you over, basically they have all the rights to go through your stuff and things like that. But like in other countries, even though my country is so messed up, the system is messed up, but the officer's judgment is important. Another thing that we need to work on the criminal justice system in the United States. We need to work on their judgment. They need to use a good judgment. If they don't know how to use a good judgment, bad things happen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Can we have one more round of applause for our panelists?